Finnegans Wake is infused with universals in order to understand their construction and how we might deconstruct them, committing them to a genealogical critique. Joyce shares in this project with Deleuze and Guattari in Anti-Oedipus, who critique Freudian Oedipalization of the unconscious. In Anti-Oedipus, they look at the way in which Freud privileges the family as the central or exclusive locus for analyzing the unconscious, trying to trace everything back to the Oedipal triangle, or as Deleuze and Guattari put it, the mommy-daddy-me triangle. For Freud, the myth of Oedipus the King is a universal structure for understanding how the unconscious reacts to and compartmentalizes the world. But Deleuze and Guattari state that this universalization requires the imposition of totalizing frameworks upon multiplicity that ignores outliers, variation, ambiguity, and individuality. Thus, Oedipal sexuality encodes incest as a universal tendency, because one starts loving their mother as soon as they come out of their mother, because she's the first thing that they see, the first thing they get attached to, and thus boys come to hate their father and want to have sex with their mother. However, Deleuze and Guattari want to focus on how Oedipal sexuality must be deployed as a tactic or a strategy by the analyst, ignoring the individual experience and accreted sense of the meaning of symbols and imagery for the patient. As Foucault puts it in regards to sexuality more broadly, the deployment of sexuality established this notion of sex. In other words, the very conceptions we have of sexuality and of identity in general come to code the kinds of elements that we see as significant or not. And schizoanalysis, Deleuze and Guattari's method, bypasses this authoritarian approach to the unconscious, in Freudian terminology, the id, by denying the id, by denying the essentializing conception of the unconscious as some universal structure. As they put it, opening up Anti-Oedipus, it is at work everywhere, functioning smoothly at times, at other times it fits and starts. It breathes, it heats, it eats, it shits and fucks. What a mistake to have ever said the id. Everywhere it is machines, real ones, not figurative ones. Machines driving other machines, machines being driven by other machines with all the necessary couplings and connections. Joyce shares in Deleuze and Guattari's project of schizoanalysis, or as Joyce puts it in Finnegans Wake, sexophonologistic schizophrenesis, by refusing universalizing conceptions of the unconscious, rejecting dogma and the tendency to reduce groups to a set of essential qualities. While commonality and repetition are necessary in order to establish a sense of consistency and groundedness, Joyce understands individuals as profoundly undercut by their nearness to the void, the nothingness or unground of being itself, which upsets and actively pummels our attempts to establish totalizing conceptions of identity. As Joyce puts it in Finnegans Wake, a rude breathing on the void of to be. Here it's very explicitly stated that to be, the quality of being, is a void itself which breathes down our neck. He puts it more esoterically later in the work. I should like to euphemize that. It sounds an isochronism, secret speech, Hazelton, and obviously disemboweled. But it is good lay law too. We may take these well-meant kicks for free granted, though ultra vires void and in fact unnecessarily so. Happily, you were not quite so successful in the process verbal whereby you would sublimate your blaspherospasmodical suppressions, it seems. Joyce here obliquely confronts the void, disemboweling vowels, that is, vows that we intend to honor, and vowels or actions that we may have done and are ashamed or displeased with. And in the process, we see suppression of ourselves through sublimation, thus invoking some key Freudian terminology. But the key to this secret speech, I would like to argue here, is personal, not universal. Punning on the void, he writes, "In the beginning is the void, in the muddle is the sound dance, and there and after you're in the unbewised again, von Volsi Volsi. You talker donskers brogmen, we, our souls, speech obstruct hostery. Silence in thought, sprich, where an artful of outer no sense, paw paw, wall wall." Here we are confronting the void and the word not as a universal historical moment, i.e. in the beginning was the word from the Gospel of John, but as an imminent present state of action and existence, hence is. It's happening right now. The void or nothingness is thus the ever-present limit and unground, motivating and making possible all creativity in the now. Thus, Finnegans Wake attempts to fill this void with knowledge of the past, that is history, and knowledge of ourselves, that is psychoanalysis, viewed not as an innocent resurrection of facts, but rather as a value-laden construction of truths, a project intimately conditioned by and dependent upon one's goals, beliefs, and context. Thus, in Finnegans Wake, we witness an act of creation, i.e. Joyce's creation, not the creation, in medias res, or as he puts it, the cess of the wisp, of the sigh of the soft sing at the stir of the ver gross, o arondo of a long one in medias reeds. And shades began to glitter along the banks, greepsing, dusk unto dusk, and it was as gloaming could be in the waste of all peaceable worlds. Thus, finding ourselves deep in the middle of the individuality of Joyce as a writer and ourselves as readers reflecting upon the characters and writer, this focus on individuality brings us to a taboo at the heart, or perhaps the head, of the dreamer of Finnegans Wake: incest. Throughout the book, the sleeping HCE struggles with the ensuing guilt from a lewd crime committed in Phoenix Park, or Phoenix Park, as it's put. While its exact nature is inexact, it seems to have involved several young temptresses. ALP speaks as a woman of the world who only can tell naked truths about a dear man and all his conspirators, how they all tried to fall him, putting it all around localized about Private's earwicker and a pair of sloppy sluts, plainly showing all the unmentionability falsely accusing about the raincoats. HCE's all-pervading yet acceptable obsession with the young women that are the sloppy sluts takes a taboo turn when a flurry of innuendos begin filling the book, which seem to signal a father's dirty obsession with his daughter. And we see a tremendous sublimation of this thought in the tale of the aunt and the grasshopper. Incest in Finnegans Wake is sublimated through a long chain of cross-linguistic associations, starting with the name HCE, which stands for Humphrey Shimpton Earwicker. Earwicker then becomes earwig, an earwig being an insect, which is sublimated by the S and C switching places and becoming incest. Thus, we can see how the intention of the dreamer is buried and absorbed by dream logic, transformed into a tale about insects, which introduces us in about as explicit of terms as we'll ever get to the act of incest. The grasshopper was always jigging a jog, hoppy on account of his joyousity. He had a partner pair of findle stilts to supplant him, or if not, he was always making ungraceful overtures to Flo and Luz and Beanie and Vispatula, to play Puppa Puppa and Pullacy Pullacy and Langtenas and Push Pigdium, and to commence insects with him, their mouthparts to his orifice, and his gambols to their airy processes. Even if only enchased, among the ever-listings, behold a whispering pot. He would have cursed maliciously by his forefeelers, flexors, contractors, depressors, and extensors, lamely, harry me, marry me, bury me, bind me, till she was puce for shame, and also formish her in Spanisher's housery at the east best Schopenhauer. So summary is his cottage, which was called familiarly Ting Somengenting groped up. As I'd like to argue here, however, HCE, through the mediation of thinking, through the mediation of writing, through the mediation of reading, is able to productively face his limits and desires in an instructive way. On page 459, he says, Oui, is he done that, I confess, seeming to confess to his lewd intentions, spoken by my lewd speaker, and of the wicked untruth. However, he says, Lower, and I'll be strictly forbidden always, and true in my own way, and private, where I will long to betrew you along, with one who will so betrew you that not once will I betrew him, not once will he betray himself. Convoluted as this is, it seems to show that he knows his limits, even if he's not able to put it into the most semantically simple way. Finnegans Wake is thus, in part, ethical instruction for all readers, since HCE is here comes everybody, an imposing everybody he always indeed looked, constantly the same as and equal to himself, and magnificently well worthy of any and all such universalization. Every time he continually surveyed, amid vociferatings from in front of accept these few nutties, and take off that white hat, relieved with stop him grog, and put it in the log, and lutes in his Bascovo boots. From good start to happy finish, the truly Catholic assemblage. But this brings us to the question, is Joyce not succumbing to or even deploying universals here? Is Finnegans Wake one long command regarding human nature? Not simply telling us that it exists, but also that it'd be good for you if you simply obeyed your nature like a good little subject? Well, I'd like to argue here, no. Just as Deleuze and Guattari acknowledged the importance of repetition and its ensuing structure, produced through a process of territorialization in which norms and identity are sedimented, so too does Joyce acknowledge our need for repetition. I would urge one to view Finnegans Wake not as repeating universals, though, but rather repeating leitmotifs that are constantly changing and being uttered anew. As an exemplary and rather self-reflexive example of this concept, repetition with a difference, itself a central concept in Deleuze's theory, first articulated in Difference and Repetition, consider the following two passages. Then all that was fair, 'tis Elvenland, teams of times and happy returns, the same anew. Ordovico or Vito ricordo, Anna was, Livia is, pluribels to be. Or consider alternatively, she's fading out like journey's close, so you can't see her now. Still we know how day the dyer works, in dims and deeps and dusks and darks. And among the shades that Eve's now wearing, she'll meet a new fiancé, tryst and trow. Mammy was, Mimmy is, minusculines to be. In the D dips a dame, and the dame desires a damsel. But the damsel dresses dolly, and the dolly does a dummy damble. The same anew. For though she's unmarried, she'll after truss up, and help that husband how to hop it. Hip it, and trip it, and cherub and sing. Lord Chuffy's sky, Haruff and Glugs got to swing. Now one could claim here that Joyce is repeating some primordial, universal symbol or song, since we can clearly recognize some similarity amidst the motifs, even amidst the great differences in these passages. But, a la Deleuze, it is crucial that we read Joyce here as arguing that we do not need to presuppose an essence in order to perceive and recognize sameness. Unity is not the precondition for a conception of identity. In fact, we only need assume our ability to recognize difference is due to some essential similarity if we're assuming that knowledge is primarily an act of rational cognition. If we take the Cartesian route, itself exemplary of modern philosophy as a whole, all knowledge is for him a function of our ability, through the interior act of cognition, to represent the world as an image to ourselves. However, this needlessly and problematically conceives of the world as a collection of human-created, human-mediated, and human-dependent concepts. Thus, when we look at the world through this framework, we assume that any similarity must be the result of an initial act of cognition. Hence, recognition is recognition. But since Deleuze, and I would argue Joyce, rejects the subject-object split of Descartes and its reliance upon knowledge as an act of rational cognition, we don't need to assume some universal, original essence of identity standing outside of and prior to our experiences in order to make sense of their relations to one another as similarity and difference, or difference and repetition. Thus, Joyce focuses on language as an action that, rather than owing to a metaphysical essence, reveals itself as a bodily affective event that can be experienced as ontological difference that, due to its sonic capacity, experiences degrees of resonance. Hence, the similarity that we can see between these passages is in part a result of their sonic similarity and the lilting rhythm that accompanies them. So what does all this have to do with incest, one might ask? Well, incest carries tremendous meaning in Finnegans Wake when we consider it not simply as a matter of content, a narratological relation between textual entities as characters, but, like all things Finnegans Wake, as a matter of form and style as well. Finn Fordham, in his Lots of Fun at Finnegans Wake, Unravelling Universals, considers the Wake characters in the Wake are not transparently obvious to themselves, but rather are internally ramified throughout the text in ways such that they are fighting their own alterity, a point central to Freud's understanding of the duel between the conscious and unconscious mind, as well as Lacan's understanding of the subject as constituted by an internal bar from itself. This leads to tremendously deep internal conflicts between different versions of the same character. Can they even properly be called the same character anymore? This philosophy of character is so radically multiplicitous that it radically undermines the concept of individuality as characters literally burst into multiple alternative personas. For example, HCE is himself, but he's also both of his sons Shem and Sean, as well as Buckley, as well as Finn McCool, as well as the Duke of Wellington, as well as Charles Stewart Parnell, etc., etc. The very notion of identity in Finnegans Wake is thus so wrought with the aforementioned Deleuzean theory of identity as non-essentialist difference and multiplicity that it struggles to maintain personal coherence on the level of characters or the text at large. Thus, Joyce implements a technique of repetition which Fordham calls an incestuous writing. He says, Stephen Dedalus defined incest via Aquinas as an avarice of the emotions. And here we have an avarice of characterization, an incestuous writing. Rather than develop new characters for the purposes of complicating or enriching the plot, incestuous writing confuses these characters into versions of each other, economizing on plot and confusing it. This radical identity conflict is at the heart of Finnegans Wake's conception of itself as what Deleuze and Guattari theorize of as a rhizome, explicitly citing Joyce in their attempt in A Thousand Plateaus to define the concept. Writing, Joyce's words, accurately described as having multiple roots, shatter the linear unity of the word, even of language, only to posit a cyclic unity of the sentence, text, or knowledge. Nietzsche's aphorisms shatter the linear unity of knowledge only to invoke the cyclic unity of the eternal return, present as the non-known in thought. This is as much as to say that the fascicular system does not really break with dualism, with the complementarity between a subject and an object, a natural reality and a spiritual reality. Unity is consistently thwarted and obstructed in the object, while a new type of unity triumphs in the subject. The world has lost its pivot. The subject can no longer even dichotomize, but accedes to a higher unity of ambivalence or overdetermination, in an always supplementary dimension to that of its object. The world has become chaos, but the book remains the image of the world. Radical chaosmos rather than root cosmos, and that word chaosmos comes from Finnegans Wake. A strange mystification, a book all the more total for being fragmented. At any rate, what a vapid idea, the book as the image of the world. In truth, it is not enough to say, long live the multiple, difficult as it is to raise that cry. No typographical, lexical, or even syntactical cleverness is enough to make it heard. The multiple must be made, not by always adding a higher dimension, but rather in the simplest of ways, by dint of sobriety, with the number of dimensions one already has available, always n-1, the only way the one belongs to the multiple, always subtracted. Subtract the unique from the multiplicity to be constituted, right at n-1 dimensions. A system of this kind could be called a rhizome. As such, it is crucial that we see Finnegans Wake as an anti-universal text. Reveling in multiplicity and a de-hierarchized vision of the world, it radically demands individuality on the level of character, text, and reader, while at the same time placing our very notions of concrete identity into question. Can I meaningfully read, write, or create and remain the same? Can I live without becoming different from myself? Echoing this attitude of disdain for dogma and absolutes, Joyce writes in his essay on James Clarence Mangan that he refused to prostitute himself to the rabble or become a mouthpiece for politicians. He was one of those strange, aberrant spirits who believed that the artistic life should be nothing other than the continuous and true revelation of the spiritual life, who believed that the inner life is of such worth as not to depend on any popular support, and so abstain from offering confessions of faith. One who believes, finally, that the poet is sufficient unto himself, inheritor and preserver of a secular heritage, and has therefore no need to be strident, preachifying, or cloyingly sweet. It seems apt, therefore, that any reader who attempts to replicate the approach of such an idol as Joyce's Mangan was, resist dogmatic, totalizing, and reductive interpretations, which seek answers or solutions. Rather, one should accept Joyce's proclivity for asking probing and existentially valuable questions as itself the task of a great reader, who then becomes an interpreter, teaming and coaxing out creative meanings from the text. That being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been helpful in thinking about these ideas. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. I also have a channel membership available if you would like to, for $5 a month, become part of a monthly private philosophy Zoom. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate one time to the channel, because it really helps me out and takes some pressure off me, but no worries. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.